service to our nation. The Department of Homeland Security and its dedicated employees have faced no shortage of challenges and challenging missions over the past few years, and we are grateful for your steadfast commitment to protecting the American people. Today's hearing is an important opportunity for Secretary Mayorkas to detail the department's plans for the resources included in the President's 2024 budget request, so that the committee can assess what resources and authorities that DHS needs to fulfill its critical missions to safeguard our nation from rapidly evolving security threats. I'm pleased to see that this year's proposal includes several investments to help combat persistent and evolving threats to people in Michigan as well as all across our country. For example, relentless cyber attacks from criminal organizations and foreign governments continue to pose serious threats and disruptions to Americans' daily lives. We must ensure that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also known as CISA, has the resources to stop sophisticated cyber attacks. I'm grateful that the 2024 budget proposal includes significant resources for CISA, our nation's lead cybersecurity agency, to address these serious threats. I'm also glad to see that your request includes funding to help implement my law requiring critical infrastructure owners and operators to report to CISA if they experience a cyber attack or make a ransomware payment, which will help warn other potential targets and allow law enforcement to hold cyber criminals accountable. We know cyber attacks will stop at nothing to infiltrate our networks, and we must continue to strengthen our cybersecurity defenses to prevent further attacks. Our nation also faces a number of threats to the safety and security of our communities that DHS must address. Domestic terrorism, driven by white supremacists and anti-government extremists, continues to be the most significant terrorism threat to the United States. I have continued to press DHS to adequately track and report data on the domestic terrorism threat. Despite being required to do so by law, Senator Johnson and I authored, the DHS continues to fall short on collecting and reporting this critical information. I have been pleased to see that more recently the department has done more to track and share information about the domestic terrorism threat, and I'm going to continue to work with our colleagues and DHS to ensure that we are devoting the appropriate resources to prevent any such attacks. We also face potential threats from weaponized biological, chemical, nuclear, and radioactive materials that are capable of inflicting mass casualties and destruction on our country. Last Congress, I introduced bipartisan legislation to reauthorize and strengthen the DHS office responsible for managing these threats. These authorities are set to expire, but the threat clearly remains. So I'll work with my colleagues on a bipartisan basis to ensure that these vital protections are extended. Similarly, authorities to help prevent attacks from unmanned aerial systems, more commonly known as drones, are also set to expire. Whether they are being used recklessly or by an operator who has harmful intentions, drones could pose serious security threats to mass gatherings like sporting events, concerts, and more. Senator Johnson and I also introduced legislation on this last Congress, and I will continue to work to reauthorize and strengthen needed authorities to counter the escalating threats from drones to protect public safety, critical infrastructure facilities, and airports. I'm also looking forward to discussing the department's plans to secure our northern and southern borders. With the expected wind down of Title 42 next month, we must ensure that DHS is prepared to address the irregular flow of migrants at our southern border, and I look forward to hearing more about the department's plans to address that change. The administration is also taking efforts to better secure our ports of entry and prevent illegal drugs like fentanyl from reaching our communities, including by investing in more non-intrusive inspection equipment. These efforts are a vital part of ensuring secure and efficient lawful trade and travel at our ports of entry so that border states like my home state of Michigan remain a hub for international commerce. Last spring, I was honored to host Secretary Mayorkas in Michigan to hear firsthand from members of Michigan's Arab and Muslim American communities who have for years endured lengthy and intrusive secondary travel screenings. And although DHS has the critical mission of protecting our transportation systems, it must do so in a way that respects civil rights and civil liberties. Mr. Secretary, we have spoken about the President's promise to examine the terrorist watch list and no-fly list, and I believe it's time to accelerate this interagency effort to bring relief to these as well as other communities. And finally, natural disasters driven by global climate change present one of the most serious security threats to our nation as well as to the entire world. And I've been proud to work with DHS on efforts to mitigate damage from natural disasters, and we must ensure that the department has appropriate resources to protect communities from catastrophic consequences related to these weather events. However, I'm concerned about the process for a current reorganization of FEMA's Resilience Office. The committee has been asking for an update for the past 5 months, but FEMA has yet to provide one. I certainly hope for greater transparency and partnership between DHS and this committee in the future and with future reorganizations. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to having a productive discussion today about the department's mission and plans to address the many homeland security threats that we face as a nation, and appreciate once again your service to our country. Ranking Member Portman, I always say that, I apologize. Ranking Member Paul, you are recognized for your opening comments.
In 2002, Congress established the Department of Homeland Security in response to the 9/11 attacks to centralize and consolidate to prevent terrorist attacks. In the 20 years since its creation, the Department of Homeland Security has departed from its original mission and used its expansive authorities and funding to impede on the rights of American citizens. This is not just my opinion. In November 2022, the ACLU concluded 20 years later, it's past time to seriously reconsider DHS. Its abusive practices aren't just antithetical to our values, they're a waste of taxpayer dollars and a distraction from serious problems facing people in our country. What should terrify every American is that the full extent of DHS's abuse of power against its own citizens are still largely unknown. The public is only recently learning the degree to which the department's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, was employed to surveil and censor American citizens' social media for what it concluded to be misinformation and disinformation. What was the result? Statements about COVID-19 that are now supported by evidence were flagged as disinformation. Statements, including my own, that were once labeled by our government as disinformation, such as opinions on the efficacy of masks, naturally acquired immunity, and the origins of COVID-19, are now supported by the majority of people and by the evidence, but were labeled by the government as misinformation. The government worked with social media, in fact, to censor these opinions. This is something that shouldn't happen in a free country, and is contrary to the spirit and the law of the First Amendment. In 2021, DHS even put out a video encouraging children to report their own family members to Facebook for disinformation if they challenge the U.S. government narratives on COVID-19. Does that not sound like something out of 1984? Does that not sound like something out of Stalin's Russia, that our government's trying to get our kids to report their parents? I mean, that's crazy. Can you imagine? Your agency's putting out a video to tell kids to report their parents if they say something like, well, maybe children don't need to be vaccinated. I still say that because it's the truth. The risks for the vaccine are greater than the disease for COVID for children. It's different for the elderly and those who are targeted with the disease, but that's an opinion based in fact, based on peer-reviewed papers. But that's not that government shouldn't get involved with trying to censor and restrict my ability to say these things. In reality, the most significant source of disinformation during the pandemic, with the most influence and greatest impact on people's lives, was the U.S. government. The greatest purveyor of disinformation has been the U.S. government. All of this was occurring during what was likely the greatest national security threat to our nation in modern history, a global pandemic that killed millions of Americans. During this time, the Department of Homeland Security, working to determine the origins of COVID-19 pandemic and whether taxpayer funding went to conduct risky research in China, was this going on? To our knowledge, we know of no delving into this by the DHS. Where did the virus come from? If it came from a lab, wouldn't that be a biosecurity threat? Isn't that somehow under the purview of the DHS to be looking at where the virus might have come from? At least several of the intelligence agencies now conclude it did come from there. Dozens and dozens of the most esteemed scientists in our country now conclude that it came from a lab. We have labs doing this research in our country. Are you looking into that? You know, what's going on? Are you really trying to protect us from biological threats if we're not being told that you've looked into the origins of COVID virus at all? Instead of focusing on real threats like this, DHS was internally strategizing on how it can expand social media censorship of Americans using third-party nonprofits, as in the words of a CISA official who said, a clearinghouse for information to avoid the appearance of government propaganda. So here's our government using NGOs and using them as a clearinghouse, but let's make sure nobody sees that it's us so it doesn't look overtly like government propaganda. That's coming from your own agencies. A report published last month by the Brennan Center for Justice found at least 12 overlapping DHS programs for tracking what Americans are saying online. It found that the department's programs have veered from its original counterterrorism mission into tracking social and political movements and monitoring First Amendment protected activity of American citizens. This is a serious abuse of power. The report concluded that overbroad mandates, flimsy safeguards, and fragmented oversight have allowed overreach and abuses to proliferate across DHS intelligence programs. This is the kind of abuse of power that should terrify all of us, regardless of which side of the aisle you are on. Even worse, it is taking place while the department is failing miserably at one of its core responsibilities, securing our border. Congress cannot continue to provide more funding responsibility to an agency that so clearly misunderstands its statutory authorities and purpose.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. Secretary Mayorkas, it is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses, so if you'd please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is the 7th Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Previously, he served the department as Deputy Secretary and as Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and began his public service at the Department of Justice. Mr. Secretary, again, thank you for your appearance here before our committee once again, and I'll now recognize you for your 7-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, distinguished members of this committee. Last month, we marked the 20th anniversary of the department's creation, which brought together different agencies from across the federal government in a determined effort to safeguard the United States against foreign terrorism in the wake of the devastation wrought on September 11, 2001. Over the past 20 years, the challenges facing the homeland have grown increasingly dynamic and complex. The department's 260,000 public servants meet these challenges with unflinching dedication to mission. With acts of targeted violence occurring more and more frequently, we are sharing with local communities the best practice models of detection and intervention when an individual is exhibiting signs of moving towards violence. We are on the ground assisting communities impacted by increasingly severe and frequent extreme weather events. We are attacking cartels and smugglers through new campaigns and enforcement surges, efforts that have resulted in the arrest of more than 9,100 smugglers, the disruption of over 9,000 human smuggling operations, and record seizures of fentanyl at our ports of entry. We are rescuing victims of human trafficking and child exploitation and bringing perpetrators of these heinous crimes to justice. We made 3,655 human trafficking arrests last fiscal year alone. We are defending networks in our hospitals, schools, and electric grids from wide-ranging cyber attacks. We are on patrol in the Arctic and in the Western Pacific to protect our interests. This is just a snapshot of the work our extraordinary personnel do every day to keep the homeland safe. The evolving set of challenges we face requires a modernized budget, and the President's fiscal year 2024 budget for DHS provides the department with the resources it needs to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the threats of today and tomorrow. The displacement of people across the region is greater than at any time since World War II. I have visited the southwest border approximately 16 times as Secretary to meet with our personnel and to see firsthand the challenges they face and the tools they need to do their jobs. The fiscal year 2024 budget proposes the hiring of over 1,400 additional personnel to secure the southwest border, including 350 additional Border Patrol agents and 310 additional Border Patrol processing coordinators to get more agents back into the field performing their critical law enforcement mission. The budget proposes $535 million in new funds for border technology, $305 million of which is to deploy new technologies and capabilities in our fight against the trafficking of fentanyl through our ports of entry. The environment across the southwest border is dynamic, and the annual appropriations process does not provide the flexibility to address challenges that often change sector to sector, month to month. We propose that Congress create a fund that can be spent for specific purposes when certain migrant encounter thresholds are met. This would equip our personnel with the tools they need to meet migration surges if and as they occur, like transportation resources, soft-sided facilities for processing, and grants to support state and local community reception. The budget will also enable the department to process the increasing number of asylum cases, address the backlog of applications for immigration benefits, support the Citizenship and Integration Grant Program, and improve refugee processing to meet the goal of admitting up to 125,000 refugees. Our critical infrastructure is increasingly the target of cyber attacks launched by transnational criminal organizations and hostile nation states, including the People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This budget invests in personnel, infrastructure, and enhanced tools and services to increase our cybersecurity preparedness and resilience. We look forward to working with the committee this year to codify our Cyber Safety Review Board in law to ensure it has the authorities necessary to be effective. We must also continue to build a culture of preparedness so that communities that face increasing extreme weather events are ready and resilient. This budget provides $20.1 billion for FEMA to assist individuals and state, local, tribal, and territorial partners impacted by major disasters and funds efforts to build climate resilience. The United States Coast Guard provides critical capabilities to defend our national interests in the Western Hemisphere, the Arctic, and the Indo-Pacific. This budget makes strategic investments in the Coast Guard's fleet of offshore patrol cutters and polar security cutters that will advance our security and economic prosperity. Finally, the men and women of DHS who serve our nation are our most important and vital resource. We cannot expect to recruit and retain a world-class, diverse workforce if they are not compensated fairly. We are asking for $1.4 billion to honor the promise of pay fairness to our TSA workforce. This budget will enable the department to respond to the threats of today and prepare for the threats of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary, since 9/11, the U.S. government has focused its counterterrorism mission primarily on international terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But DHS certainly was created during that time specifically to address the threat that we were facing here at the Homeland. But in recent years, you and your counterparts at the FBI and the Department of Justice have made it clear that while certainly foreign threats have not disappeared, and we need to keep our eyes wide open and our watch strong, white supremacists and anti-government extremists at home, however, are now the greatest threat to America. So my question for you, Mr. Secretary, is can you tell us specifically what you have done to shift resources in your agency to address the current threat landscape when it comes to domestic terrorism?
Mr. Chairman, you correctly note that the foreign terrorist threat has not disappeared, but only new threats have evolved. Over the past 20 years, the threat landscape has proven increasingly complex and dynamic. To address the threat of domestic violent extremism that has risen tremendously over the last several years, we've taken a number of measures. I created a domestic terrorism branch within our Office of Intelligence and Analysis. We have increased our funding to local communities so that they have the capacity to identify when an individual is descending down a path to violence and intervene so an act of violence does not materialize. We have issued information bulletins and alerts more frequently to our law enforcement partners in communities as well as to the American public to advise them of the threat and to be ready and prepared to address it should it materialize. We have done quite a number of things to address the evolution in the threat landscape that we in the Department of Homeland Security challenge.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, Title 42 is slated to end in under a month, as you well know, on May 11th of 2023. The question for you is, what changes are you anticipating in terms of the number of migrants arriving at the border after May 11th? And what preparations is the administration making to deal with those individuals seeking asylum?
Mr. Chairman, we do anticipate a surge in the number of encounters at our southern border. Our overarching approach, the overarching approach of this administration, is not only to invest in the countries of origin, given the reasons why people flee their homes, whether it's an authoritarian regime, persecution by reason of an individual's membership in a particular social group, increasing violence, poverty, corruption. What we are doing is building lawful pathways so individuals do not need to place their lives and their life savings in the hands of ruthless smugglers who only seek to exploit them for profit. At the same time, delivering a consequence for those individuals who do not avail themselves of the lawful pathways we provide. And we have exemplified that model in the parole program that we announced on January 5th of this year for individuals from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. We have indeed seen people avail themselves of the lawful pathway, and we've seen an over 95% drop in the number of encounters at the southern border as a result of those programs. We are surging resources to the border. We are going to be using our immigration authorities under Title 8 of the United States Code, which delivers a consequence for individuals who arrive in between the ports of entry who do not have a lawful basis to remain in the United States. We are working with local communities to increase their reception capacity. We are working with our neighbors, our partners to the south, Mexico and other countries, because we are seeing is not exclusive to the southern border. The level of migration that we are experiencing at the southern border is reflective of the level of migration that is gripping the entire hemisphere. Just last week, I was in Panama to work with our Panamanian and Colombian partners on a regional solution to what is a regional problem. We are doing so much more to be ready for the potential surge in migration at our southern border upon the end of Title 42. Importantly, Mr. Chairman, we are also taking it to the smuggling organizations that spread disinformation to vulnerable migrants and fraudulently coax them into taking what they are deceived into thinking is a safe journey, and it is anything but that, as we so tragically know.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, you and Director Wray made clear before this committee in November that we must ensure that the DHS and DOJ are properly resourced to meet the growing threat from drones operated by nefarious actors here in the Homeland. We're entering a season of outdoor sporting events in Congress, in concerts, and other mass gatherings. Could you please tell this committee what you see as the threat from drones and why it's important that the authorities that are set to expire are extended and that we need to continue to focus on this issue?
Mr. Chairman, I have spoken to our personnel in the field who operate drones as well as operate counter-drone activity. And they have communicated to me quite powerfully the need to be able to have our counter-drone capabilities not only continue, but expanded and work with law enforcement. I have met with the leaders of sports leagues who've spoken about the threat that drone activity over stadiums, mass gatherings pose. I have spoken with airport executives about the threat that drones present to our airspace, our orderly and safe oversight of our airspace. I've spoken with our Border Patrol personnel about how the cartels use drones in an effort to smuggle narcotics across our border. The drones are increasing in capacity, in speed, in distance of travel, in load that they can carry. This is a threat to the homeland, and our counter-UAS, our counter-drone authority, must be continued. We look forward to this committee's support of that authority and expansion of it. We cannot allow it to expire this year.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I can assure you we're focused on this very, very real threat. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
The FBI and the Department of Energy have concluded that the likely origin of COVID is from a lab in Wuhan. Jeffrey Sachs of the Lancet Commission studied this for nearly 2 years and came to the same conclusion. 18-month investigation from the HELP Committee also came to the conclusion that the likely origin of the virus is from a lab in Wuhan. What are the conclusions of the Department of Homeland Security on the origins of the virus?
Ranking Member Paul, we defer to other departments and agencies whose remit is to investigate the origins of COVID-19. To my knowledge, that is not work that we have undertaken.
So when all of the different agencies report to the Director of National Intelligence, are you one of those agencies? Like they say, there's 17 different people have an opinion supposedly on this. So the Department of Homeland Security has not made any opinion or given any opinion to the Director of National Intelligence based on any research that you have done?
Ranking Member Paul, to my knowledge, we have not undertaken our work to investigate the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we have done in response to what you accurately captured are its tragic consequences is we set up vaccination centers all across the country.
The National Biological Threat Characterization Center is under your purview. Do they investigate or evaluate the manipulation of viruses, either through recombination or mutation or cellular passage, serial passage in lab? Do they look at the threat of dual use? Basically, people say, oh, we're doing research for vaccines, but what if this escapes into the world and you've created a virus that never existed before? Is that under the purview of the National Biological Threat Characterization Center?
Ranking Member Paul, I do believe that that organization looks at how biological elements and other elements can be weaponized to the detriment of our security.
You know, there's at least 12 different places in the United States where labs are getting this. To make it even, more concerning, though, we've been funding labs, not only the lab in Wuhan, we've actually funded military research in China. We now have evidence that NIH money goes to American universities who then subcontract it to the Academy of Military Medical Science Research, AMMS. It's finally now been listed as a category of where we're not supposed to export things, but for years now, somebody's asleep at the switch. Whether it's you or somebody else in government, we got a big government, we got all these different intel agencies, we got, who's watching? Because the thing is who in their right mind would think it is a good idea to send American tax dollars to a university, an American university, who then sends it to do military research? Now, even the stuff over there that's civilian research is only as good as we can trust them that that's really what it is. And there's much evidence that there's an intermingling of military and civilian and dual purpose research over there. And so somebody's got to do something here. Somebody's got to step forward. And my suggestion to you is if you've got something called the National Biological Threat Characterization Center, that you'd look at the 12 universities in our country that are doing this kind of research. So basically they're taking a virus and it's known to infect humans, and they're taking a portion of another virus they don't know anything about and saying, well, let's see what happens if we put a new protein on this other virus to see if it's more infectious or more lethal. And quite a few times when they do these experiments, gain of function research, the people within government say, oh, well, nothing to see here, it's not really gain of function. Then they play with the definitions. And yet 1 million people died from something like this. 1 million people died from a leakage of a virus. This isn't the first time. There are dozens or entire books written of leaks. There are probably 100 leaks from U.S. labs that have been documented in the last several years. And yet we have an agency that I think sometimes is talking about things that may not be quite as pressing as 1 million people dying in the homeland. So, my suggestion is that we maybe should take some of our resources. I think you asked for $17 million for this biological threat characterization center. Maybe some of that ought to be used in evaluating some of the dual science and dual purpose research that's going on within the U.S. We would like to get information, and just last week, Senator Johnson and I sent a letter 2 weeks ago asking for any information you have on the origins of this. We passed unanimously, which is something, unanimously in the Senate and the House to declassify this information. But our problem isn't even that. Most of this stuff is declassified, and we get refusals from everybody in the Biden administration. We've been stonewalled for the last 2 years, and we get nothing. We not only get nothing, we have FOIA'd things that a federal judge requires them to release, and we have talk back and forth, chatter on email from people at DITRA saying, well, we're not going to give it to him because one person's signing this, and it looks like he signed it individually, so we're just not going to give it to him. And then we have other people saying in the same email chain, that doesn't look good. If that gets FOIA'd, let's change the language because that doesn't look good. This is our government. We complain about the Chinese not giving us stuff. What I would like today is the assurance that you're going to give us any information we ask related to the origins of COVID. You say there hasn't been much, and maybe there hasn't been, but we would like to get responses to these things instead of responses that say, take a leap. This was the elected government. We were hoping to get help from the other side, but so far we haven't gotten any help from the other side on trying to get these records. But we would hope you would do it just because you care about 1 million people dying. So that's my request, is that you at least will respond to our request asking for more information about the origins of COVID.
Ranking Member Paul, I have a number of things to say. Number one, I share your concern with respect to the threat that the People's Republic of China presents to the homeland, number one. Number two, to my knowledge, DHS has not done, does not have ongoing work, and has no future plan to do work on assessing the dangers that may be associated with gain of function research. My understanding is that no work has been done, no work is planned, and no work is underway. Third, I believe that you have sent to the department a letter requesting information in just a couple weeks ago, within the last 2 weeks, and it is our intention to respond appropriately to your letter.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Peters and Ranking Member Paul, for this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, not only for being here, but for your service to our country. I want to start with a question about the northern border. Last week, I visited the northern border in New Hampshire to speak with Border Patrol officials. Over the past year, we have seen an 800% increase in border apprehensions in the Swanton sector, which includes New Hampshire, as well as an increase in drug trafficking, some of which is tied to Mexican drug cartels. CBP reassigned 25 additional Border Patrol agents to the Swanton sector earlier this year, but more personnel and resources are needed. What additional actions is DHS taking to strengthen security at the northern border, including stopping drug cartels from smuggling drugs and people into New Hampshire and our neighboring states?
Senator, thank you very much. please be assured that we are very focused on the security of the northern border, just as we are focused on the security of the southern border. I worked with our partners to the north, with my Canadian counterpart, to finalize the Safe Third Country Agreement that we have with Canada, which indeed will further strengthen the security of the northern border. I am, of course, working very closely with the Acting Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to make sure that our people and our technology are deployed most effectively on the northern border. And this is one of the reasons why we have requested in the fiscal year 2024 budget additional personnel for U.S. Customs and Border Protection so we can enhance the security of all of our borders.
I appreciate that. Let me just follow up on the issue of communications and technology a little bit. Many parts of the northern border, New Hampshire and elsewhere, are remote and really difficult to access. Is DHS adding more technology and communications infrastructure along the northern border? And in particular, one of the real challenges there is just very limited cell service. So even if we give CBP officials mobile phones, they can't necessarily access the kind of communication we'd like. So are there specific things you all have done or plans you have to help upgrade there?
Senator, I will follow up on specifically what we are doing to address the cellular connectivity challenge in the northern border areas. I will say, because you've correctly captured the remoteness of some of those areas, one of our challenges is also recruitment of personnel. So we're very, very focused on the myriad of issues.
Right, and I heard from some of the personnel there on Friday about ideas they have for recruitment, so I'd look forward to working on that with you. Let me move on to another issue. Press reports indicate that DHS has apprehended dozens of individuals at the southern border who are matches to the terrorist watch list. Reports also indicated that there's been an increase in watch list apprehensions over the past few months. What steps are you taking at DHS to intercept individuals on the terrorist watch list long before they arrive at the U.S. border?
Senator, the fight against terrorism is our highest priority in the Department of Homeland Security. Our obligation is to ensure the safety and security of the American people. Any individual who is apprehended, who is on the terrorism screening data set, it's called the TSDS now, who poses any threat is detained, and his or her removal is indeed sought. One of the things that we are doing with our partners to the south is increasing our biometric sharing with them so that they are able to identify individuals who are interdicted, understand their profiles, determine whether indeed they pose any threat, and take appropriate enforcement action. It's very important to note that an individual's presence on the terrorism screening data set does not necessarily mean that the individual is, in fact, a terrorist. They could be, for example, a member or an associate of a member of a group that was once designated, right, but is no longer designated as such.
Understood, but I think the more we can do, and I look forward to following up with you on thwarting that threat before it gets to the border, the better off we all are and the safer we are. I want to talk about another issue on the southbound border. U.S. and Mexican authorities obviously need to work together to stop the flow of fentanyl, meth, and other dangerous drugs that are manufactured in Mexico and smuggled into the United States. You testified about that. We've done work on increasing technology and the like at the border. But Mexican authorities have indicated that they need U.S. law enforcement authorities to do more to disrupt the flow of weapons and money flowing south to drug cartels. CBP only inspects a small percentage of southbound people and cargo before they leave the U.S. What does DHS need in order to perform more southbound inspections and intercept guns and money flowing south?
Senator, this is indeed a subject that we have discussed with our Mexican counterparts. In fact, in the last time I was in Mexico, I discussed this with the Foreign Secretary of Mexico. We are seeking in our fiscal year 2024 budget additional personnel and additional technology to assist us in the interdiction of contraband, firearms, and other and money flowing southbound. Our Homeland Security investigations, the criminal investigative arm of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is indeed investigating the flow of funds and the flow of firearms and seeking to interdict them on an increasing basis.
Okay, and I will follow up with you on that as well. One last follow-up on this general issue. Last week, the Treasury Department announced sanctions against 2 Chinese companies supplying precursor chemicals to Mexican drug cartels, and DEA and DOJ announced charges against 28 members of the Sinaloa cartel. Another way to fight the drug cartels is for DHS to provide international security and to help Mexican authorities stop precursor chemicals from being illegally shipped from China to Mexico. How can DHS provide additional support to Mexican authorities in order to strengthen our own security? And what training, resources, equipment, or other methods of support can DHS provide?
Senator, we are sharing information and intelligence. We are strengthening the port security in Mexico. We are assisting our Mexican counterparts in doing so. We have our transnational criminal investigative units. Again, Homeland Security investigations, working with Mexican partners to interdict the flow of chemicals, to stop the flow from the People's Republic of China of not only the precursor chemicals, but also the equipment used to manufacture fentanyl.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hessen. Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Good morning.
Didn't bring my chart. It's just too depressing to look at, of apprehensions on the border. It's abject failure. But I'm hoping that you came a little bit better prepared in terms of going through the numbers with me. And I guess rather than ask you for the numbers, which I've never gotten straight answers on, let me just run by you the numbers that we've got off of many times right off your website. Total nationwide encounters during the Biden administration, just shy of 6 million. Is that about right?
My understanding of apprehensions is that is almost 6 million. Yes.
So again, you're calling them encounters now, which I think is a strange turn of a phrase.
Well, the reason
total expulsions on, well, I know, because you're not apprehending them. You're just encountering and then you're dispersing and processing and dispersing them. Total expulsions under Title 42, about 2.4 million. So that means 6 million minus 2.4, about 3.6 million people have been encountered, very efficiently processed and dispersed, correct? About 3.6 million?
So there are other ways that individuals are addressed, Senator Johnson. For example, they can be removed under Title 8 of the United States Code.
So how many have been removed under that title then?
In fiscal year 2022, I record just over 360,000 individuals have been removed under Title 8. There are also, Senator, there's also the ability to have individuals voluntarily return to their country of origin.
So how many is that number? How many voluntarily returned?
My understanding of the data in fiscal year 2022, it was approximately 260,000 individuals.
So I'll take 500,000 off of that, okay? So 3.6 down, take 500,000 away from that, it's about 3.1. According to Border Patrol Chief Ortiz, about 1.4 million known gotaways. I mean, is that a correct number, 1.4?
Last year, Senator, and by the way, if I may, you combined multi-year figures with the data that I provided, which was for 1 year.
That's because you don't publish this stuff in a very understandable way. So a large number of people are getting away that we know about. We don't know who these people are, but they're just gotaways. They're never encountered. They get away into the interior. Then we've got one estimate's about 0.3 million unknown gotaways. Okay, that's the estimate. So somewhere north of 4 million people. I had a number down here, 5.3, but we're adjusting that down based on Title II expulsions and I guess people voluntarily going home. Somewhere between 4 and 5 million people during this administration have been coming to this country, probably don't qualify for asylum, but that's a pretty accurate number, right? 4 to 5 million?
Senator, let me first communicate a premise, which is we are very, very focused on the security of our border.
No, you're not. No, you're not. I don't want to listen to that. So basically what we're looking at is 22 states have populations less than 4 million people. 28 states have populations less than 5 million people. That is the magnitude of the problem. Do you know how many dead bodies were discovered on the southwest border in fiscal year 2022?
Senator, when you...
Listen, I don't have much time. Do you know how many dead bodies were discovered?
Senator, this is precisely why we are seeking to
Do you know?
make sure...
I'm not looking for a, do you know how many dead bodies were discovered in 2022? What's the number?
Senator?
It's, it's 890, according to a news article in the Wall Street Journal, which I'd like to enter in the record. I'd also like to, can you enter that in the record? Thank you. I'd also like to enter into the record a couple of New York Times articles, oddly enough, written by Hannah Dreyer. This one is published on February 25th, 2023. It's titled, "Alone and Exploited, Migrant Children Work Brutal Jobs Across the U.S." I just want to quote from this article, "But as more and more children have arrived, the Biden White House has ramped up demands on staffers to move children quickly out of the shelters and release them to adults. Caseworkers say they rush through the vetting process." It goes on, "Data obtained by the Times show that over the last 2 years, the agency could not reach more than 85,000 children. Overall, the agency lost immediate contact with about a third of the migrant children." It goes on, "It's going to be a business for some of these co-sponsors," said one of the people trying to place these folks, one of the caseworkers. But the caseworkers at those agencies said the HHS regularly ignored obvious signs of labor exploitation. In interviews with more than 60 caseworkers, most independently estimate that about 2/3 of all unaccompanied children end up working full-time. It goes on, "As the government, we've turned a blind eye toward their trafficking," says Doug Gilmer, the head of Birmingham, Alabama Office of Homeland Security Investigations, a federal agency that often becomes involved with immigrant cases. Mr. Gilmore teared up as he recalled finding 13-year-olds working in meat plants, 12-year-olds working at suppliers for Hyundai and Kia, and children who should have been in middle school working at commercial bakeries. Mr. Secretary, do you know how many young girls are sex trafficked? Are you following any of those cases? Do you have HSI investigating that form of involuntary servitude because of your open border policies?
Senator, our Center for Combating Human Trafficking presents one of our greatest priorities within the Department of Homeland Security. It is precisely why I've taken 2 important steps. Number 1, identify for the first time human trafficking and child exploitation as a priority for the Department of Homeland Security. Number 2,
but you are failing miserably. 4 to 5 million people, 1.4 million unknown gotaways. We have no idea who those people are, what kind of security they risk. You're not giving me any stats whatsoever in terms of the number of people that are human trafficked, how many young girls are sex trafficked. You don't have a clue. You wouldn't even answer how many dead bodies, which is very well documented, at the border. Do you not care? Do you not have just an ounce of human compassion for what your open border policy, the type of human depredations it is causing? You just sit there looking with a blank look on your face and you're saying it's a priority. If it's a priority, how did we let 4 to 5 million people in this country in a little more than 2 years? 4 to 5 million people. The population of 20 to almost 30 states. And you're saying this is a priority? Mr. Secretary, you ought to resign.
Senator Johnson, Secretary, sorry, I'd like you to respond to.
Well, I have a number of responses. The Senator mischaracterizes our policies with respect to the security of the southern border. The senator, of course, disparagingly mischaracterizes our commitment to address human trafficking and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals, including children. And the senator misstates the data because he confuses encounters with unique individuals. But a number of things I'd have to say in addition to the senator's statements, and I would look forward to doing so, Senator Johnson, subsequent to this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Senator Scott, you're recognized for your questions.
First off, I want to thank Secretary Mayorkas for being here. I think all of us have been pretty frustrated with the unbelievable increase in number of people on the border. But let me talk about a separate issue first. Let's talk about this disinformation. And you've read the stories and you've seen what Elon Musk is saying. So there's a whole bunch of people in the Biden administration that have put out false narratives. They've said the border's secure. They've said Hunter Biden's laptop is not real. They said the Afghanistan withdrawal was successful. They said the Chinese spy balloon over the United States is not a threat. I mean, that's all that, as we all have found out, is untrue. Now we've learned from the Twitter files is that government is working with and funds NGOs to censor millions of Americans via big tech in direct violation of our First Amendment rights. So my first question, Secretary, is how many people that work in Homeland Security have been accountable for breaking the law? And first off, do you believe that the government looking at private messages on Twitter is a violation of the law?
Senator, we don't censor speech, so I want to nip that misimpression in the bud. We don't do that, and I should say that the personnel of the Department of Homeland Security, not only the more than 260,000 personnel, not only have unflinching dedication to mission,
So nobody's violated the law?
but also have unflinching loyalty to the law that they enforce.
So let me ask, let's start real simple then. Is the border secure? Is Hunter Biden's laptop not real? Was the Afghanistan withdrawal a success? Or was the Chinese spy balloon a problem? Do you believe any of those are, the Biden administration said all those things.
Senator, let me say this. We are extraordinarily dedicated to the security. If I may.
Secretary, I know, look, I'm not going to suggest you're not dedicated, but let's just go to the facts. The Biden administration said all those things, and now Elon Musk has been clear that the Biden administration has had access to private messages on Twitter messages. Okay, so step one, do you believe it's right for the government to be reviewing private messages on Twitter?
So, Senator, if I may, I have to defer to law enforcement investigative agencies that might do that in the course and scope of a criminal investigation. I will share with you, as a former federal prosecutor for 12 years, we do have tools at our disposal when we are investigating a criminal case to do certain things. That is not within the remit of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, so I can only speak now to the work that we in the Department of Homeland Security do. I will share with you, with respect to the Chinese spy balloon, if it's the one to which I think you refer, that we shot it down because of the concern we had with respect to its purpose and identity.
So you're comfortable that, other than a criminal investigation, that nobody at Homeland Security was reviewing private messages on Twitter?
To my knowledge, Senator, that is the case, and what I'd like to do, because you raise a very important issue, because I can assure you that it is not our job, nor do we do it, to censor speech. What we do is we assess the threat landscape that this country confronts so that we can secure the homeland and protect the American people. That's what we do. And our Office of Intelligence and Analysis has a responsibility which it fulfills to understand that threat landscape, to understand what the threats are that we face.
How many people do this? How many people work at DHS doing this?
So I would have to take a look at the number of personnel within the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. I'd rather not. I'd rather not guess, but we have an extraordinary, relatively now, new leader of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis.
So number one, nobody at Homeland Security has been reviewing text messages or Twitter files, except in criminal investigation?
As I said before, Senator, I want to be perfectly accurate so that I address the concern that you have.
If they did, would you fire them?
Oh, Senator, please allow me to explain. I don't know the specific contours of the law in this discrete area. I can assure you that we comply with the law, and any
But do you think
failure
it's right?
if I may, and any failure to comply with the law would be addressed appropriately.
Do you think it's right on a non-criminal investigation for somebody to be looking at private Twitter files? Do you think that's right?
Senator, if you're asking for my opinion, which is not informed by the law, which is,
I get it.
and please understand that as a
I get-
former
I mean,
federal
I get that.
prosecutor, precision and accuracy are quite important to me. I would be concerned with that activity. I would share your concern.
Has anybody that you know of ever been fired at Homeland Security for violating anybody's First Amendment rights?
I don't know the answer to your question, Senator.
You think anybody has?
All I can tell you is this, that I have tremendous admiration for the workforce of the Department of Homeland Security. I have tremendous admiration for their integrity. I have tremendous admiration for their dedication to mission. And if in fact someone acted inappropriately, I can assure you that does not reflect the character of the entire workforce.
One thing, one thing that surprised me up here is the fact that it's very difficult for anybody to ever hold anybody accountable for violating the law. I mean, on so many areas, I'm just fascinated that we don't do that. So at anybody at Homeland Security, or is Homeland Security funding artificial intelligence technology that assists in any way of censoring Americans online?
Senator, not to my knowledge, we don't do that. But let me. When you speak of holding people accountable, Homeland Security Investigations, the main criminal investigative agency within the Department of Homeland Security, does an extraordinary job in holding people accountable for criminal activity, whether it's in drug trafficking, online child sexual exploitation, human trafficking, the theft of intellectual property. So many different areas. We hold perpetrators accountable and also rescue victims and enable them to become survivors and move on with their life. I'm incredibly proud to support those personnel.
I think you should. My only question is have you ever held anybody accountable at the agency? I think the agency does a lot of great things. I guess my question is, does anybody ever get held accountable if they do something wrong?
They do indeed. They do indeed, and we have a number of means of holding people accountable. But people who are held accountable for wrongdoing do not represent the workforce of the Department of Homeland Security, and I cannot overstate that too much.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mayorkas, good to get a chance to visit with you again. We visited multiple times on this, and a lot of times that we've talked to you, laid out a new strategy, new plan. I mean, the numbers you know well, of the dramatic increase in the number of people crossing our border without a lawful authorization to be able to do so. That has continued to accelerate. Unfortunately, from last month to this month, that's continued to increase again. We've talked about multiple times. You've laid out different ideas. Here's a new strategy we're going to have. Here's a new strategy we're going to have. Each one hasn't slowed the flow down on it. You have laid out from the department a new strategy again that you hope to have implemented. The comment period is ended on that. It is the circumvention of lawful pathways regulation. It's out there. The comment period is now closed. You're going through those reviews. When will that be implemented?
Thank you, Senator. If I may, because you said that, if I understood you correctly, that none of the measures that we have taken have reduced the flows. Actually, the measures that we announced and implemented on January 5th with respect to individuals originating from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela has led to a more than 95% drop in the number of encounters of individuals from those four countries at our southern border. So that is a model of building lawful pathways, as well as delivering consequences.
But as you and I both know, the numbers continue to climb, total numbers. From those countries, the numbers have dropped dramatically, but the total numbers continue to go up. For this fiscal year, for just the 6 months of this fiscal year, it's about 160,000 higher than last year. Last year was 1 million more higher than the year before, so the numbers still continue to climb, total numbers. So what I'm trying to figure out is, for this circumvention of lawful pathways regulation that you're planning to implement across the board, do you expect this 95% reduction that you've seen in those identified countries after it's implemented? And if so, when is it going to be implemented?
Senator, we are adjudicating the comments that were received. There were many, many comments received in response to our notice of proposed rulemaking. And so it's very difficult during a comment period to talk about the promulgation of a final rule. It is our intention to promulgate a final rule unless there are certain comments that dissuade us from doing so. That is not where we stand right now. We are moving as quickly as possible to adjudicate the public comments, and that notice of proposed rulemaking, as well as what we announced on January 5th, reflects an overarching strategy of building lawful pathways so that people who qualify for relief can actually reach the United States in an orderly and safe way, consistent with the law, and then as a complement to that, deliver consequences to those who do not avail themselves of the lawful pathways. That's the model that has worked in the past, that we intend to build upon, and we are indeed building upon.
So you have mentioned in the past that the asylum system, or that the system is broken. This new rule that you're promulgating at this point deals directly with the asylum process on this. Is it your assumption that the asylum process itself is broken, that is being abused?
Senator, yes, the asylum system is broken and our entire immigration system is broken. I think there is unanimity about that, and it is our continuing hope that Congress will reform a broken system.
Is part of that the credible fear standard? Part of that the credible fear standard, is that part that is actually broken as well? And if so, what would your recommendation be? What do you need at that point?
I think that the credible fear standard needs to be reviewed in the context of reviewing the entire asylum system. One of the most fundamental problems that we have sought to address through a regulation is the fact that the time in between when an individual actually first claims credible fear, the initial threshold in an asylum case, and the time of final adjudication of their asylum claim is historically been more than 4 years, and that reflects a broken system.
Yeah, it's a very broken system. When I've gone through some of the numbers on this, and it is my concern, and through your budget documents on it, let me just give you some of the numbers here that your team has released out that's made publicly available on this. For the alternatives to detention, the backlog that's there actually getting to this next step from ICE. If they've received a notice to report, or the parole plus alternatives to detention backlog, if they request to go to New York, currently, right now, their next hearing time in New York is in March of 2033. So it is 10 years before they get that hearing, and that's not the final adjudication of it, as you know well. That's just the ICE portion of it, and then they get in line to go after that. So we could be 15 to 18 years before this asylum system is actually, before their asylum claim is actually adjudicated. Part of my struggle on this is when I visit with USCIS folks on this, if they're in the non-detained docket, which I have a whole legal question on that, if they're in the non-detained docket, they're not getting to them at all because their priorities on the detained docket, rightfully so, because that's where the law requires them to be able to do. But the non-detained docket, they're not getting to, don't know when they're going to get to. ICE has hearings set 10 years into the future to get to the first step of this process for them. This is clearly not working in the process. And on top of all of that, I was shocked to see in your budget request a reduction in requests for new detention space, or maintaining detention space. So while we have got this incredible backlog in the non-detained docket, you're actually requesting fewer spaces when we have an acceleration of the number of people here? What am I missing?
Four responses, if I may. Number one, we are not seeking a reduction in detention space. What we have done is place the funding for additional detention space in a contingency fund so that we could draw upon it if and when the number of encounters require additional detention of individuals. So we have moved it to a contingency fund for the reasons I outlined in my opening remarks.
But then that could be used for other things at this point, but the detention numbers should be at epic levels, historic numbers, so I'm a little confused why we may need to flex that to other things when even your testimony earlier said we anticipate after Title 42 ends, we will see a surge again of individuals. So there's an anticipation of a surge of more individuals coming across the border, yet you've moved the detention dollars to a contingency fund to say we may or may not need those.
Well, that's speaking of fiscal year 2024, not fiscal year 2023. We are hopeful that the measures that we are taking will diminish the number of encounters at our southern border. The proposed rulemaking to which you referred originally, building upon the success of the program we announced and implemented on January 5th. It is our continuing hope that Congress will reform our immigration system. And Senator, with respect to your other points, the time in between encounter and final adjudication has plagued our immigration system for years and years and years. It is why we are also seeking funding for more asylum officers, and this administration for the first time took action to reduce that time lapse by issuing a regulation that gave the authority to asylum officers to make the final asylum adjudication and bring that multi-year timeline down to under a year. The first administration to do so.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Lakeford. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
There we go. Well, thank you, Chairman Peters, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Secretary Mayorkas, for testifying today and for your work. And we're going to continue talking about terrorism at the border because I do have significant concerns about the security of our southern border, both as migration continues to increase and as deadly drugs like fentanyl get trafficked into our country in large quantities, threatening all of our communities. And I'm also concerned about the potential for terrorists to take advantage of our porous border, including Iranian proxies. As you know, Homeland Security investigations plays an important role in combating criminal entities that threaten our national security interests, and over the past year, it has successfully disrupted multiple Iranian threats, including recently seizing the illegal transfer of more than 1 million rounds of ammunition, along with additional weapons. These are critically important efforts to combat terrorism abroad, but I do worry about whether we're also doing enough to stop this threat closer to home at our border. So, Mr. Secretary, I have two questions. First, can you speak to HSI's coordination with other U.S. agencies to ensure that preventing the illegal transfer of Iranian weapons and energy products is collaborative, a whole-of-government effort? And second, to follow up on Senator Hassan's question, given the increase in foreign extremist activity on U.S. soil, including Iranian assassination plots of now former U.S. government officials, how is DHS working to combat threats from foreign terrorist organizations to the U.S. homeland, including by increasing security efforts at the U.S. southern border between ports of entry?
Senator, let me assure you that the safety and security of the American people is our highest priority. Homeland Security investigations, an extraordinary criminal investigative agency within the Department of Homeland Security, works very, very closely with our partners across the federal government, not just the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but the Drug Enforcement Administration and other law enforcement agencies. Not only that, it is working on task forces with state and local, tribal, and territorial partners across the country. You correctly identify the adverse nation state of Iran as a threat to the homeland, and we are very focused on this, not just in the way that you have identified, but in the myriad of ways that it seeks to do us harm, to include the spread, for example, of disinformation.
Thank you. And I know how important it is to combat terrorism, but there are other fights we have to have too, and we have to address the rise of anti-Semitism. And of course, across America, Jews are facing an alarming rise in anti-Semitism. I don't have to tell you that. And according to the FBI, anti-Semitic hate crimes increased by nearly 20% in 2021. And these anti-Semitic hate crimes represented the majority of religious-based hate crimes committed that year. So this surge in anti-Semitism, it's affecting communities across our country, again, whether through terrorist attacks on our synagogues, anti-Semitic flyers being left outside of Jewish homes, businesses, or anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are unfortunately spreading rampantly online. And so I appreciate that last November, when I asked you in this committee whether you would support the development of a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, you responded that you would. And a few weeks later, the White House announced the formation of the new interagency group to do just that, develop the first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which will outline comprehensive actions on the federal government side that will undertake to root out this type of hate. And so can you give us an update of how Department of Homeland Security is working with the White House to develop the national strategy, and what are the department's implementation plans to execute the strategy?
Senator, thank you very much for your support and encouragement of delivering on our commitment to address the incredibly troubling rise in anti-Semitism in this country. Just yesterday, I delivered remarks to the American Jewish Committee's Belfer Center to speak about the rise in anti-Semitism and the compelling need for all of us to work together to address it and to address all forms of hate. There is no such thing as a small act of hate. When one group is targeted, we are all targeted. Here again, our Office of Intelligence and Analysis is assessing the threat landscape with respect to anti-Semitism and other forms of hate and its connectivity to violence, and disseminating information to our partners so that communities are aware of the threat and prepared to respond to it. We investigate or support the investigation of acts of hate along with and closely with our law enforcement partners across the enterprise. Very importantly, we are also developing best practice models to identify when an individual who expresses hate is moving towards violence. It is the connectivity to violence that is where we in the Department of Homeland Security are most intensely focused.
Well, thank you. I agree that recognizing and disseminating info to partners within each of our communities is key, so I appreciate that. And speaking of partners and risk formulas, I want to talk about your program formulas and risk ratings in the short amount of time I have left, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly here. We have the UASI formula and the SEER designation. Those are both processes that I believe are in need of significant reform to better reflect the actual risks to our communities. The SEER, or Special Event Assessment Ratings, they determine the level of federal support that you provide to high-risk events. So for Nevada, this fall, we have the Formula One race. And next January or February, I don't know the date exactly, we have the Super Bowl. Of course, we have lots of other things going on, and so it is really important that we update the UASI and the SEER ratings. And so what are you doing, and I can take this off the record, I see my time is up, I know there's others behind me, to address the mismatch between the risk to a special event and the Homeland Security support that state and local law enforcement are receiving to keep attendees around surrounding communities safe. I know I've gone over my time, so we'll take that off the record, but we'll look forward to that remark. Unless you wanted me to say one.
Thank you, Senator Roosevelt. You want a quick response?
Okay.
Very quickly, and
Perfect,
I'll
thank you.
build upon it, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, I've directed a review of both the SEER rating process and the UASI risk formula process. I asked our Homeland Security Advisory Council to look at the UASI and other grant programs. Our risk formula has not been updated for many years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Marshall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Secretary Mayorkas.
Good morning.
With last night's border crossing numbers, you've broken another record, hitting well over 5 million illegal border crossings under your watch. And the American people believe that this administration still has no plan to address the issue. The safety and security of families is the #1 concern I hear from my parents, from my family, from people up here in the Senate. You've made every community a border community. And the increase in fentanyl deaths and skyrocketing crime proves that. 300 people dying every day in America from fentanyl poisoning, a plane crashing every night. I'm concerned that we have no idea who's coming into our country. Since the beginning of the fiscal year 23, Border Patrol has encountered 70 illegal aliens who are listed in the terrorist screening database. In fiscal year 22, 98 illegal aliens on the terrorist watch list were encountered at the southern border. Do you know how many terrorists, including this database, have crossed our southern border and are currently residing in our country?
Senator, let me assure you that the safety and security of the American people is the highest priority of the Department of Homeland Security and my highest.
And there's a big difference between priority and accomplishments and doing what you're supposed to do. So can you answer my questions about the terrorists that have crossed the southern border that are still in this country?
Let me assure you, Senator, first of all, we work tirelessly.
I understand that. You are going to answer the question? I work tirelessly, you work tirelessly, Americans work tirelessly, but our country is under attack and we're not safe. Do you have any idea how many terrorists have crossed the southern border that are still in our country? I assume that you don't. Let's go to the next question. Under your leadership, this administration deported fewer illegal aliens than any other in modern American history. However, your budget reveals there are over 5 million aliens on the non-detained docket for deportation. 5 million. Of those 5 million, there are 400,000 convicted criminal aliens residing in this country. Let me say that number again, 400,000 convicted criminal aliens residing in this country. Your budget requests only enough money to remove 7% of those people. How do you justify allowing nearly 500,000 convicted criminal aliens to remain in this country, in our American communities? And how does that keep American citizens safe to permit known criminals to remain in the country?
Senator, a number of things, if I may.
I'd rather have the short answer on this question.
I'm going to give you
Lock in on this question if you can, please.
I'm going to give you a short answer, and it has multiple parts because there are multiple responses. Number one, you are not accounting for the $4.7 billion contingency fund that we propose for fiscal year 2024. Number two, this administration has removed more aggravated felons per month than the prior administration. Number three, when you cite the removal numbers, you're excluding the fact that we are obligated to enforce Title 42 of the United States Code, the Public Health Authority.
Of those 400,000 convicted criminal aliens, how many do you plan on removing?
We are going to focus our efforts on the safety and security of the people and remove any individual that presents a public safety threat to the fullest extent that our resources permit.
Do you feel like leaving any of those 400,000 terrorists inside our country makes us more safe or less safe?
Senator, I'm not, first of all, you have an inaccurate factual premise to your question.
You're saying there's not 400,000 convicted criminal aliens remaining in the United States?
And we are focused on enforcing the law in the service of the American people. We will
Then do your job. Listen, my next question. According to documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, you have used your private email for official business. How often do you use private email for official business, and how are you following the DHS policy on the use of non-DHS email accounts for official business?
Mr. Secretary, I think there's some hearing issues. If you could speak a little bit more into the microphone, it would be helpful to our folks here.
Is that helpful? Your assertion is false, Senator.
Okay.
And let me share something with you. because you mentioned something about your parents, and I'm going to have a point of personal privilege.
Then I'll
and-
want my
and then I'm-
time back. If we're
and-
getting a
and-
lecture from the secretary, then I want you to answer my questions, not give me lectures. So you're not using your personal email for official business? You deny that?
Senator, if somebody errantly sends me an email on my personal email that should have been sent to my work email, I forward it to my work email. That's what I do. I fulfill my responsibilities scrupulously, and I have 100% confidence in the integrity of my actions.
I appreciate the
And let-
answer. Thank
and let-
you. I appreciate your answer. I want one more point I'd like to make here. The Secure Fence Act mandated that the Secretary of DHS, that would be you, achieve operational control of our borders. Mr. Secretary, our borders are not under control. Mr. Secretary, you are derelict in your duties. I would be derelict to not do something about this. And that's why I have a draft resolution here that I intend to introduce in the coming days that would require the Senate to take a vote of no confidence on Secretary Mayorkas. As I've stated on the record before, I stand at the ready to receive articles of impeachment from the House and conduct an impeachment trial in this body. But in the meantime, I think the Senate must show our colleagues in the House that we've had enough of the failures from the Department of Homeland Security and believe that the Secretary is not fit to faithfully carry out the duties of his office. I would like to insert this into the record. Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and I yield back.
Senator Marshall, Senator Carper, recognized for your questions.
Secretary, you tried to say something in response to something Mr. Marshall was asking. You were not given that opportunity. Take a minute and just respond, please.
Thank you very much, Senator. I think I'll elect not to.
All right. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Paul, fellow colleagues with whom I have the privilege to serve on this committee for a long time. Before I get into my questions, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge Secretary Mayorkas' leadership of the Department of Homeland Security. When I talk about integrity, I often say if you have it, nothing else matters. If you don't have it, nothing else matters. And Secretary Mayorkas has it. He is principled, he's a thoughtful individual, and one with an incomparable work ethic who understands the complexities of DHS and the threats that our country faces. It's hard for us to imagine how what his job is like day in and day out. Grateful to him for doing it. And I also want to say that I know he deeply cares about, not just about DHS, the department, its mission, but most of all for its people. He has dedicated himself to serving our nation for decades, and in turn sacrificed what I'm sure to be invaluable time with his wife and their children. Furthermore, he's worked tirelessly to advance the security and well-being of our country. And I just want to take a moment to ask my colleagues here today to treat the Secretary with respect he deserves. I was raised, my guess is that most of the folks in this committee were raised to treat other people the way we want to be treated. I wouldn't treat anybody the way that I've seen you treated before in other committee and again here by at least one of our colleagues today. I want to talk about root causes and ask you about root causes if I could. We focus a lot on the symptoms of the problems at our borders, and it's important that we do so. But it's also critically important that we address the root causes of why people are arriving at are continuing to arrive at our southern border. This past February, as you know, Mr. Secretary, I led, along with Senator Hassan, a bipartisan, bicameral congressional delegation to Mexico, to Guatemala, and to Honduras. One of the main takeaways from my CODA was the importance, our CODA was the importance of strengthening the rule of law and addressing corruption issues. And until we address both of these push factors, we're not going to see the kind of return on our investment that we need in this region. And people continue to arrive at our borders 10, 20, 30 years from now. Secretary Mayorkas, with that in mind, could you please speak to efforts you are taking to foster regional partnerships in the Western Hemisphere and how the department is addressing migration challenges from the region, please?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your opening comments. The migration challenge that we are encountering at our southern border is not exclusive to the southern border.
Speak up just a little louder.
The migration challenge that we are encountering at the southern border is not exclusive to the southern border of the United States. It is a challenge that is gripping the entire hemisphere. We have a level of migration throughout the Western Hemisphere, in fact, throughout the world, that is at its peak since World War II. A regional challenge requires a regional solution, and we are working very, very closely with our partners to the south to address the reasons why people leave: violence, poverty, authoritarian regimes, public corruption, and the like. We're seeking to address the root causes of why people leave their homes, as well as to work with these countries, our partner countries to the south, to build lawful pathways, to have them build the capability to enforce their laws of humanitarian relief, as well as their laws of consequences to enforce their respective borders. This requires a collective action. Last week, I was in Panama to work with our Panamanian and Colombian partners. We had a trilateral meeting to address the challenge of the Darien, the very treacherous land between Panama and Colombia, where people are beginning to migrate north, ultimately seeking to come to the United States, because we are the greatest country in the world and the land of opportunity, and we have 10 to 11 million open jobs in the United States. And I hear from employers across the political spectrum the need for labor, and that is a message that is transmitted and exploited by smugglers. This is a regional problem. It requires a regional solution, and we are working with our partners to the south to deliver it.
Thank you. Thanks for that response. The president's budget requests, I think it's about $865 million for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services uses budget, and for the immigration services that they offered, in order to address issues like the increasing asylum caseloads, processing times for immigration applications, and improving refugee processing. On a personal note, this issue is something that I hear about a lot from my constituents in Delaware. We hear a lot about, from our businesses in Delaware and across the country, about the desire to have people come to work. We got 10 million people, 10 million jobs today where nobody's showing up to do the work. And we hear from businesses all the time who said, there's some people in other countries like to come and do these jobs. Why can't we allow them to do that? And I think that's a pretty good question to ask. But on a personal note, I hear a lot as well about our folks at home been facing delays on processing times with routine applications, as well as for urgent and humanitarian applications relating to Afghanistan and the Ukraine. Mr. Secretary, I believe you're a former director of USIS. Can you speak to the importance of getting that agency the necessary resources it needs to carry out its many missions, and how this budget request will address some of the challenges at that agency?
Senator, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services administers our country's legal immigration system. It is predominantly funded through the fees it receives from individuals applying for immigration benefits. And the law provides that every 2 years, the agency is to recalibrate its fee structure according to adjusting costs. The agency, under the prior administration, was absolutely gutted and did not issue a new fee rule to rebalance its finances according to its financial needs. It is why a proposed fee rule is being issued or has been issued, and we're receiving and adjudicating comments for the first time in more than 6 years, and why we seek supplemental funding for the agency in the President's fiscal year 2024 budget.
Thanks. My time is expired. Could I just ask a question for the record, Mr. Chairman? It'll take just 15 seconds.
May proceed.
Thanks very much. Mr. Secretary, how will this budget request from this administration help address the retention and recruitment of the workforce, and support the effort to improve employee morale across the various DHS components? That's a question for the record, if you'd respond for the record. Not now, but later.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Romney, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got a note at the outset, Mr. Secretary, that you described the hemisphere-wide concern and a desire to address some of the root causes that encourage people to leave their countries and come to ours. I would note that that is an impossible task. The United States of America is always going to be in a more attractive place for people to come live than in the countries that you're describing. We have a stronger economy. People have much better lives here, much healthier lives and so forth. The idea that we're going to somehow solve the root causes in all of Latin America of corruption, of the kind of military threats going on, it's just not going to happen. So we're going to have to secure our border. And I would anticipate that if we continue to have the kind of global warming that we've been having, that there's going to be an even greater demand to move into our country. So we're going to have to secure our border. And sure, we're going to try and help other countries to the extent we can and encourage them to adopt policies that will make them more likely to be successful and to have less pressure to send people to our country. But they're still going to keep coming here. I presume you agree with that. They're going to always be, I mean, during our lifetime, a huge demand for people coming into our country from Latin America.
I do agree with that.
Yeah,
And I,
okay.
And I look
So all the talk about we need to address root causes, it's like, come on, guys. This is taking our eye off the ball, which is we need to have our border secure. Give us a grade. How are we in terms of securing our border? Our southern border first. How, is it an A, B, C, D, E, or F? In terms of the security of America's southern border, is it an A or an F? Where do you grade it?
Senator,
I'm looking for a letter.
Senator, it's not so
Well,
straightforward.
sure it is. We know how many people are coming across. Are we doing a great job, or is it like still failing?
Senator, the issue of addressing the root causes is not
Not
exclusive.
I have a question, which is, can you grade how secure our southern border is, an A through an F?
Senator, we are dedicating our resources to achieve the maximum possible effect of them.
Well, are we succeeding? Is it an A, or is it B, a D? Where are we in terms of the number of people coming across the border? For instance, we have gaps in a wall. It's like, why wouldn't you want to just complete the wall, for Pete's sakes? Complete the fencing and make sure that we're, in every way we can, securing it, at least physically, as well as the other sources that we have.
Senator,
But you're not willing to give it a grade? I mean, I am. It's an F. It's clearly an F. Do you disagree?
Senator, I have actually approved almost 130 projects for the closing of gaps and the completion of gates on the wall. So I understand your concern, and I want to return to the fundamental point that addressing the root causes is not exclusive of securing our border. It is in addition to, it is a complement of, and it's not about eliminating migration in its entirety. I agree with you, but it's about reducing the level of migration so people who do not want to leave their countries of origin actually have the capacity to remain and build a life for themselves there.
We can't solve poverty here. We can't end crime here in our own country. The idea that we're going to do it in dozens of countries across Latin America and reduce the desire of people to come to America is just not realistic. Let's devote our resources to securing our border. Second topic, which is our asylum system. I mean, is that a broken system from your standpoint? We have 1.6 million people who are in line for adjudication on their asylum claim. These claims would take years to process. Is this system working? Do we need new legislation? Do we need to change our asylum system somehow? How do you grade our asylum system?
Senator, our asylum system is broken. Our entire immigration system is broken and in desperate need of reform, and it's been so for years and years. And it is why the President submitted on his very first day in office proposed legislation to fix it.
Good, thank you. Let me just turn to one more topic in the short time I have. Last Congress, the minority staff on this committee issued a report highlighting failures at DHS and HHS to adequately vet and monitor unaccompanied children that are coming into the country. Over 290,000 such children entered the country during 21 and 22. 3/4 of them were released to sponsors. Many of the children, as we understand now, released to sponsors under the program have reportedly been trafficked into forced labor or even sexual abuse. What are you doing to address this problem? It's increasingly in the public awareness. Are we making progress here? What's happening?
Yes, so if I may, Senator, our responsibility by law is to turn an unaccompanied child over to Health and Human Services within 72 hours. We are not involved in the process of when HHS turns that unaccompanied child over to a sponsor, a family member, or approved sponsor. That is not where we are involved. But one important measure that we have taken is our worksite enforcement strategy is actually now focused on employers, unscrupulous employers who exploit individuals because of their vulnerability, including underage.
Do you need legislation there?
Child.
Should we increase the penalties for employers that are exploiting underage children in the workforce?
Senator, I would welcome the opportunity to work with you, to look into that, to understand the penalties and whether, in fact, enhanced penalties are warranted. I would welcome the opportunity to work with you on that.
I would also note that my guess is that if we talk to HHS, they'd say, well, this is not entirely our responsibility. I mean, both agencies are going to point to the other. So I would hope that both agencies will say, we're going to work together across agency to make sure that this problem is eliminated to the extent it possibly can be.
Most certainly, and Senator, if I created a misimpression that I was pointing the finger, I'm sorry for that, because this is a collective responsibility. This is a responsibility of the entire government and all of society.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Romney. For members' benefit, votes have been called. I'm going to be leaving temporarily to vote, but I'm going to recognize Senator Blumenthal for his questions, and he will chair this hearing until my return.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. When we were last together before the Judiciary Committee, I asked you about name, image, and likeness benefits for international students here on visas. The prime example at the University of Connecticut is Adama Sanogo, who helped the Huskies cinch the national championship, and yet he is unable to realize any benefits from his great performance, his really enormous contribution to the team. And that is because of a rule that I think you said you were going to review very, very soon. Have you reviewed it, and what's your conclusion? Senator, I have directed a review of that rule because of the concern that you expressed. I will have to circle back with my colleagues and report out to you of its status. And I'm sorry I don't have that information this morning. Can you commit that it will be in a week, 10 days? I commit to you we will deal with it with due urgency because we do owe you a response, and I understand the predicament it places athletes such as the one you mentioned. Thank you. I read recently about the very substantial numbers of children who are still separated from their families. They were separated as part of the Trump administration policy that struck me, and I think the entire nation, as cruel and unfounded, and yet they are still unable to rejoin their families. I know you have a task force that's looking at this issue. Can you give us a number as to children who remain separated from their families or parents, and what is being done to reunite them? Senator, this the policy of the prior administration to separate children from their parents was one of the most heinous policies in our recent memory, most certainly. Very proud of the work of the Family Reunification Task Force, which I am honored to lead. We have reunited more than 600 children with their families. I do not have now at my disposal the precise number of children who were separated that still need to be reunited. This is an effort that we are not undertaking alone as a government. We are working with nonprofit organizations that began to identify separated families before we assumed office in January of 2021. They're doing extraordinary work. We will not cease doing this work until we complete the task of reuniting the separated families.
How many remain to be reunited?
I'll have to circle back with you, Senator, to provide that information to you.
I would appreciate that. On an issue of local concern, but I think also should be national concern, you may be familiar with Plum Island, a really very rare resource in Long Island Sound. It has been used for the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. It's also home to pristine beaches, miles of natural shoreline, critical habitat for hundreds of plants and animals. It's a DHS facility, and it's being relocated to Kansas. I'd like your commitment that DHS will commit to working with me and my colleagues to find a long-range conservation outcome for Plum Island, particularly if possible, that it be designated a national wildlife preserve of some kind, either a national park or similarly designated so that it can be preserved.
Senator, you have my commitment.
Thank you. The Afghan Adjustment Act, which I strongly support, would address the anomalous situation of Afghan refugees. Our former translators and guards, security people who worked with us, put their lives on the line, have been brought to this country in a parole status, which unfortunately now is ending. I'm urging you to extend the parole status of Afghan evacuees and do it in enough time to advance the expiration of that status to avoid uncertainty and anxiety. Is that something that you have under consideration?
Senator, it certainly is. Operation Allies Welcome, which we led in a coordinated effort across the government, is a great source of pride for us to bring to safety in the United States individuals who stood alongside our armed forces in Afghanistan. We support the Adjustment Act, and we are indeed looking at the period of parole, its upcoming expiration, and whether indeed that should be extended.
There are, as you know, more than 88,000 Afghans evacuated, flown out of the country and resettled in the United States, and about 90% of them were granted parole for only 2 years, and so they live in this netherworld of immigration status where it's difficult for them to make plans, to get jobs, to even get housing. And so the sooner you can extend that parole status, the better, as I'm sure you understand.
I most certainly do, Senator.
Let me ask you about FEMA's disaster response in Puerto Rico. Tens of billions of dollars have been obligated Puerto Rico to rebuild and repair the island after the recent devastating hurricanes. Hurricane Maria in 2017 involved FEMA allocating about $28 billion, yet Hurricane Fiona last year still left thousands of Puerto Ricans without power for days. In October, Senator Murphy joined me in a letter to FEMA, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the U.S. Department of Energy, urging these agencies to work together and with the government of Puerto Rico in its relevant institutions to rebuild Puerto Rico with long-term resilient infrastructure. Puerto Rico has no representation in the United States Senate. So speaking on behalf of Puerto Rico, but really all of America, I think, on behalf of fellow Americans, do you commit to ensuring that FEMA will rebuild that infrastructure on the island of Puerto Rico with renewable resources and resiliency in mind. Senator, I do. I know that FEMA Administrator Criswell traveled to Puerto Rico with Jennifer Granholm of the Department of Energy, the Secretary of the Department of Energy, and I have spoken with Governor Pierluisi of Puerto Rico, and you have my commitment. Thank you. Thanks very much, Mr. Secretary. On behalf of the chairman, I call on Senator Hawley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. Let's talk about the surge in child smuggling and child exploitation that is happening on your watch. Do you know the number of unaccompanied children who have come across the border on your watch?
Senator, I don't have that number at my disposal, but I can assure you that we are incredibly dedicated to the safety and security of those children.
Well, it doesn't appear so, based on what we're reading today in the New York Times, what we're reading and seeing from numbers from your own office. The answer to my question, by the way, is 345,807. That's the number of unaccompanied children who have come across the border on your watch. Do you know what's happening to these children? Have you seen this report from the New York Times? Alone and exploited migrant children work brutal jobs across the United States. Have you seen this?
Senator, I have, and let me share with you what we are doing.
Have you seen these numbers? These are reports of trafficking and abuse of migrant children. You can see a massive surge that begins to happen when? Oh, when you come to office in 2021. Huge surge, reports of trafficking, reports of neglect and abuse. Let's just look at a few of the details. This is absolutely unbelievable. I can't believe this happens in the United States of America in this day and age. This is from the New York Times. Thousands of children have ended up in punishing jobs across the country, working overnight in slaughterhouses, replacing roofs, operating machinery in factories, all in violation of child labor laws. For example, there's a young girl named Carolina from Guatemala. She is 15 years old. What does she do? She packages Cheerios overnight at a factory. She says, sometimes I get tired and I feel sick. The Times goes on, her stomach often hurt. She wasn't sure if that was because of a lack of sleep or the stress of the incessant roar of the machines or her own worry. The Times goes on, far from home, many of these children are under intense pressure to earn money. They have to send cash back home to their families while often being in debt to their sponsors, quote unquote. For what? For smuggling fees, rent, and living expenses. One individual interviewed by the Times said this, I'm still quoting, it's the new child labor. You're taking children from another country and putting them into indentured servitude. I could go on and on. The Times details over a multi-month investigation, kid after kid, child after child, one 13-year-old forced to wash hotel sheets in Virginia, kids running milking machines in Vermont, delivering meals in New York City, scrubbing dishes late at night, all in violation of our country's laws. All facilitated by your policies. Are you proud of this record?
Senator, the horrific exploitation of children is something that we do not condone. You are incorrectly attributing it to our policies. Let me share with you.
Wait a minute. It began, look at the numbers, It began, this massive surge began when you came to office. In your first year in office, there was a 342% surge of unaccompanied children across the border. You know, CBS reported that, I'm going to quote them now, Mr. Biden's election, as well as policy changes announced by his administration, those would be your changes, led smugglers to tell migrant youth they had a better chance of being allowed to stay in the United States than they had under Trump. Meanwhile, you've lost track of tens of thousands of them. The Times also reviewed data that showed the government couldn't reach more than 85,000 of these children who they just turned over into the hands of smugglers of these are modern day slave traders. And you're just giving these children to them. What is going on? Why are you doing this?
Senator, of course, there are a number of factual inaccuracies in your question, but let me address two lines of effort that we have to combat the scourge of exploitation.
Why don't we just start with why you enabled it? Can we just start with that? Why is it that you have enabled 345,000 children to be smuggled across this border and then sent into the hands of modern-day slave traders? In 2021, you made the decision to change Title 42 to allow unaccompanied children to come into the United States and then to be sent into the interior of the country. Under the last administration, children were reunited with their families in their home country. You changed that, and as soon as you changed it, the numbers exploded. That is your responsibility.
Quite a number of false statements, Senator.
What is false about that statement?
So if I can state what I've been trying to state, one of the significant policy decisions that we have made is to focus our worksite enforcement investigative efforts, our criminal investigative efforts on unscrupulous employers that exploit individuals because of their vulnerabilities, and that includes underage workers.
That is not what the New York Times investigation found. Mr. Chairman, I just ask at this point, I'd like to enter into the record the New York Times article, as migrant children were put to work, U.S. ignored warnings. This is from April 17th, 2023. This is this morning. And I'd also like to enter into the record the New York Times article, Alone and Exploited Migrant Children Work Brutal Jobs Across the U.S. This is from February 25th, 2023. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What these articles show, Mr. Secretary, is that the administration has done nothing but facilitate this crisis. You changed Title 42. You allowed hundreds of thousands of migrant children to come across the border, and then you made it worse. When they became a political crisis for you, when that huge surge of kids across the border because you changed Title 42, when it became an optics crisis, what did you do? You began pressuring officials and agencies to skip the vetting process and get these kids out as soon as possible to sponsors who weren't vetted. Here's the Times again. As shelters filled with children, the administration began loosening vetting restrictions and urging case managers to speed the process along. You have at every stage facilitated this modern-day indentured servitude of minor children. Why should you not be impeached for this?
Senator, I look forward to discussing this issue further because you are misstating the facts so terribly.
I am reading you the facts from articles in the news, and your usual modus operandi is what you're doing again today, was just to deny. Why have you permitted 345,000 children to come into this country unaccompanied? Why have you permitted thousands of them to be abused and exploited?
Senator, what we do is we enforce the law, but let me just say this.
You're not.
It is stunning to me, stunning, to hear you say that the prior administration reunited children with their parents.
Oh, I see. So this is their fault? But you're not going to take any responsibility for the indentured servitude and exploitation of children that is happening on your watch. A moment ago, you were crowing about the fact that you treated children so well, and yet we find tens of thousands of children who are forced to work as slaves because of your policies, and you turn around and blame a prior administration. Mr. Secretary, this is par for the course for you. You do it every time you appear before this committee. You do it every time you appear before Congress. I, for one, am sick and tired of it, and thousands of children are in physical danger because of what you are doing. You should have resigned long ago, and if you cannot change course, you should be removed from office. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here today. In 2022, we saw a record number of encounters at our southwest border, over 2.5 million individuals. While just under half of these migrants were removed under Title 42 authorities, the current system had multiple points of failure throughout last year. In Arizona, local governments were forced to step in to provide emergency support to avoid street releases and reassign staff from other important roles to help manage the release of migrants from CBP custody. Earlier this month, I led a bipartisan congressional delegation to the southwest border in Cochise County, Arizona, where we met with local leaders to hear how the ongoing border crisis affects their communities. And their message was clear: this crisis puts our border communities in danger. We heard from Cochise County Sheriff Mark Daniels about the issue of cartels recruiting young American teens some as young as 14 years old, for dangerous smuggling operations along the border, and the need for my recently reintroduced bipartisan legislation, the Combating Cartels on Social Media Act. This legislation would establish and implement a national strategy to combat cartel recruitment activity on social media and other online platforms. The administration's continued failures on the border put Arizona communities and our national security at risk. The ongoing influx of migrants puts serious strain on DHS resources, and it forces Border Patrol agents out of the field and into processing and administrative roles. With the Title 42 termination imminent, I remain concerned that DHS is not ready. This is the same sentiment that I expressed at this same hearing last year, and unfortunately no action has been taken between now and then to change my opinion. And more importantly, the opinion of leaders in border communities who will be left to manage the fallout. So my first question for you, Secretary, I learned this morning that the Regional Center for Border Health, the only non-governmental organization operating in Yuma County, received a denial of reimbursement for a facility that they've been operating since 2021 from FEMA and the EFSP National Board. This denial could cause the regional center to shut down operations, which would be a disaster for Yuma County, but it would also be a disaster for Border Patrol. Will you commit to working with me to identify a path forward so that Yuma does not lose its only NGO providing support to these migrant families?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the Emergency Food and Shelter Program application of the organization that you identify and the denial of their request for reimbursement. I commit to you to look into that with you and to work with you to address it as best as we can. We're very grateful for Congress's plus-up of the Emergency Food and Shelter Program to I believe the level of $800 million in total, and of course it's moving to the Shelter and Services Program in just a few months.
So thank you, Secretary. As you know, I worked very hard to ensure that funding was included in our recent omnibus, but denying that funding to the Regional Border Health Center in Yuma will literally mean that there is zero assistance for anyone in Yuma County. So I would like rapid follow-up to ensure that this community can continue to provide a safe transition and an orderly transition for those migrants. In December of 2022, migration surged due to the anticipated end of Title 42. Border Patrol encountered over 220,000 migrants just in that month. Many of these migrants were quickly expelled back to Mexico because of agreements with Mexico to accept removed individuals from certain countries. Arizonans are concerned about the status of these agreements once Title 42 authorities are rescinded in just a few weeks. Losing these agreements will drive additional migration. Is DHS working with the State Department and the government of Mexico so that they continue to accept these nationals from these countries after Title 42 ends?
Senator Sinema, we are indeed working with the government of Mexico. We are in active discussions with them. We are not only working with the government of Mexico, but we're working with other partner countries throughout the region to address migration that is at a level that is gripping the entire hemisphere, not just the southern border of the United States. You are correct in focusing on a regional solution to what is clearly a regional challenge.
On the CODEL that I recently led, Sheriff Daniels of Cochise County highlighted the dangers to his community associated with cartels targeting teenagers through social media apps. And Mayor McCaw of Sierra Vista shared how a recent chase ended outside of a local school. So my Combating Cartels on Social Media Act will help DHS counter this threat, and it'll work with social media companies to get cartel recruiters off of their platforms. Arizona communities cannot wait for this to play out on its own through the legislative process. So what is DHS doing today to solve this problem and protect American children in our border communities from this cartel criminal activity?
Senator, we are taking it to the cartels in unprecedented ways. We are working our Homeland Security investigations, personnel, the criminal investigative arm of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has surged resources to address the cartels and the nefarious activity that they engage in, not just, of course, in Arizona, but across our southern border, on the Mexican side of that border, which is impacting our border communities. We are set up transnational criminal investigative units, for example, working with our Mexican counterparts and in other countries to address the cartels, to interdict them, their activities, to disrupt and dismantle their nefarious activities. They peddle in death and destruction, and we are working intensely to address them, and not alone, but also across this administration and with our partners to the south.
So at a hearing last year in this committee with social media executives, I secured commitments from TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to share their cartel recruitment information with DHS. My question for you, Secretary, is will you increase DHS's engagement back with those social media companies to ensure that they are held to the word that they gave me in this hearing, and so that they're doing their part to prevent cartels from recruiting teens along our southwest border?
Senator, what we do is we disseminate information. We broadcast it widely with respect to the threat streams that we are encountering, so individuals and organizations can be alert to those threat streams and take the action that they think warranted. Social media companies, of course, have terms of use. They are responsible for whether or not particular communications remain or are taken off their site. What we do is we alert the American public, including the business sector, to the threat streams that we are addressing so that they can take the action they deem appropriate.
Is there any attempt by DHS to hold those companies accountable for taking action when they receive information about cartel recruitment on these social media platforms?
Senator, that is not within our remit, but I look forward to studying your proposed legislation and continuing to work with our partners across the administration to ensure that the cartels are addressed in every facet that we can.
Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired. I would just note that based on this communication, it seems evident to me that Congress will have to take action and pass this legislation. The administration will not, or is not interested in moving forward without accountability, without our legislation. So I'd encourage my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Sinema. Senator Langford, and I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Ossoff.
Thank you. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you again for being here. We've obviously got lots of questions. There's lots of issues that are still out there. I want to be able to drill down on a few others. Last time that you and I were speaking in this public setting before, I'd asked you about, do we have a knowledge of the criminal record of individuals from the country that they're coming from? We know if they're on our terror watch list. Obviously, we're aware of that. But of hundreds of thousands of people that we know nothing about, I asked you the question about, do we have access to the criminal history of individuals that are released on parole, released on notice to appear, notice to report, all the different methods of releasing individuals into the country while we're awaiting a hearing? Do we know the criminal history of the country they're coming from? At that time, you said you did not know at that point. I've not received an answer back yet. Do we know at this point if we have the criminal history from their home country before we're releasing them into our country?
Senator, what we are doing, and I apologize if I failed to circle back with you, what we are doing is seeking to have additional countries engage in our biometric data sharing program so that, in fact, the records of individuals are shared between the countries involved in the agreement. So we're very focused on that. The concern that you express is one that we have indeed followed up on, and I look forward to speaking with you further about it.
Obviously, we have hundreds of thousands, up to millions of people that are currently in the country awaiting a hearing that are traveling at will around the country right now that we don't know the criminal history of those individuals. And it's one of the threats that we do face currently, that we may very well have individuals with extensive criminal histories in their home country because people are coming from all over the world. And we just don't know who they are and don't have a process because we're not detaining those. We have about, best guess here, about 600,000 migrants who've yet to receive a notice to appear. Does that number sound correct to you? I'm not going to hold you to an exact number, but the best that we're trying to do the records on, that they've gone through the alternative to detention, that a parole plus the alternative to detention, a court said that's not a legal process to be able to go, but we think there's about 600,000 that have not received a notice to appear. Is that correct? That'd be helpful to know, because my next question on that is, what are we doing to track down those 600,000 people to be able to get them a notice to appear? Do we know where they are, and are we getting them any kind of records, or do we not have a record? We also heard that once the parole plus alternatives to detention was put out there, that was announced, that you had announced that in one of our other hearings a year ago. But it's now our understanding that that program is only in place for about 90 days per individual, that after 90 days, they no longer have the alternative to detention tracking on them anymore. Is that correct, that they have alternative to detention when they're released at the border, but that stays in place for 3 months, and then they don't have any kind of tracking method on them after that?
Understanding that on the profile of the individual for the reasons that you expressed, and if in fact one type of alternative to detention is no longer continued, we can in fact impose an alternative to that. For example, sometimes we can move from an ankle bracelet, which is one form of alternative to detention, to a smartphone that actually doesn't allow people to make calls, but only to receive a message from Immigration and Customs Enforcement as a tracking device. Two, that's a second type of alternative to detention. Two, an obligation to check in with Immigration and Customs Enforcement periodically at whatever cadence the particular case warrants. So there are a number of different alternatives to detention, and they can shift according to the
So help us with the facts and figures on that, because right now it's our understanding that there are a very small percentage of people who are actually given ankle bracelets, that it's switched to this phone, which you understand now doesn't make calls, is a tracking GPS device. It's our understanding that those individuals that got that phone now after 90 days are turning that in, or they're not doing that, doing check-in. What we're trying to figure out is how many people are actually checking in, that we actually know where they are, and we're having a very difficult time getting that number. So there's some numbers that we know that you have and that your team has to be able to track, that we're not getting access to it. This is not a partisan issue. This is just a congressional issue. When I go to your information center here, your command center here in Washington, D.C., they're literally tracking to the hour what's happening on the border. When we try to get numbers, it is, we'll get them to you when we get them to you. That's a challenge for all of us on this, and would not be acceptable for any administration, but we're not getting basic facts and data still. Or if we're getting them very, very delayed. And so it is a major issue to us just to be able to get facts and data at this point. We want to see what's happening in the border stop. I hear from you, you want to be able to see that as well. We want to see the implementation of this rule that you have out at this point to be able to get through the comment period. But May the 11th is coming very, very quickly, as you know full well, and the clock is ticking. When Title 42 ends and that 30% or so that you're turning around then accelerates into the country, a bad situation is about to get much worse. And even some in your own team have estimated we may be at 11,000 people a day illegally crossing the border. Those are numbers literally our country has never seen. And this is a growing issue on this. So help us with facts and data. You've also mentioned that you have an anticipation that Congress will pass something that deals with asylum, that deals with all the other areas. I would encourage you and your team to also make proposals on that and say, these are the things that we need to be able to secure the border. We're working on what we need and what we believe will actually work as well, but we've received very little back from your team to say this is what we need to be able to make sure that we can actually secure things. We're doing things administratively. This is what we need legislatively. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Senator, I look forward very much to working with you and presenting proposals to fix our immigration system, to build on the proposal that the President sent to Congress on his very first day in office.
Well, that proposal was universally not accepted because it actually opened the border up more. So if that's the proposal we're talking about, we're in trouble. Now, 2 years later, the regulatory piece that you're trying to put in place right now with the comment period is very different than what the President proposed on his first day of office, as you know well. If this is about the regulatory piece that you're proposing and going through the rulemaking process now, we want to talk about how we can actually fix that to be able to make sure we close the loopholes that we actually secure the border. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. Nice to see you again. I'll talk about fire safety for a moment. The Senate is currently considering reauthorization of critical fire safety grant program. that is administered by DHS and FEMA. Among the legislation that's moving toward the floor, the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program and the SAFER Program, and the chairman has done outstanding work shepherding that legislation through this committee. I was in Columbus, Georgia, a couple of weeks ago, Mr. Secretary, meeting with Chief Scarpa and his team of firefighters there and talking about how they've relied upon assistance to firefighter grants and federal support to ensure the health and safety of their firefighters and paramedics and to ensure that timely emergency response can be deployed into the community when families' lives are at risk and businesses are at risk of catastrophic damage to property. And one of the issues that was raised to me, and I'm sure you've heard this before, is that for smaller localities and jurisdictions, the process of applying for these assistance to firefighter grants can be onerous and intimidating. It's a difficult and lengthy process. And as you know, Mr. Secretary, it's oftentimes these smaller localities and less well-resourced jurisdictions that most urgently need that kind of help. So I'd like for your team to connect with mine and see if we can work together. It may not even require any legislation to look at how this program can be administered so that smaller localities with less resources who don't have full-time permanent grant writing staffs can nevertheless compete for these federal funds. Can we work together on that?
Most certainly, Senator, and I should say that this issue that you raise is something that we are already focused on across the entire spectrum of our grant programs. Organizations, whether it be in the nonprofit security grant program or firefighters, the smaller departments that don't necessarily have the resources to hire a grant applicant, we have to make sure that our grant programs are simple and accessible so that we achieve fairness in the distribution of those funds. I look forward to working with you on this.
Well, you bring to mind something that I think you could do at this hearing that would be really constructive. So you know, Mr. Secretary, that last year we had a wave of threats targeting historically black colleges and universities in Georgia and across the country. In Georgia, in the last few months, we've seen a shocking increase in anti-Semitic incidents. The front yards of Jews in Dunwoody and in Athens, hateful pamphlets, threats on the phone. Now, the DHS runs certain programs and creates opportunities, nonprofit security grants, for example, for houses of worship and for institutions of higher education to access funds and resources and information to help them stay safe. So I'm going to send this clip to the folks at faith-based institutions and educational institutions in Georgia. Can you just explain to them right now what resources the department makes available to them?
Yes, so there are multiple. One, we have a nonprofit security grant program which funds organizations to assist them in securing their facilities for the very reason that you described, Senator. I have actually convened a faith-based security advisory council to advise us on the needs of faith-based organizations with respect to their safety and security because of the rise in hate in this country, whether it be bomb threats against historically black colleges and universities, or whether it be acts of anti-Semitism or other forms of hate. We've seen a number of different strains of hate and their connectivity to violence, which is where we really become engaged, only, and sadly and tragically, increase in the United States. We also share best practices as to how organizations can become more secure and safer without becoming less welcoming for their congregations and their communities. I think following the bomb threats, if I may, following the bomb threats against historically black colleges and universities, I convened the presidents of the HBCUs to discuss the issue of safety and security with them. If I'm not mistaken, Senator, for the first time, 2 historically black colleges and universities are recipients of the nonprofit security grant program. This is an area of intense focus of ours for the reasons you identify.
Well, that's encouraging because I know that something you and I had discussed previously was improving the outreach and consistency of outreach to HBCUs so they could avail themselves of these opportunities. Mr. Secretary, last May during a hearing on the southern border, I questioned Assistant Secretary Contreras at the Department of Health and Human Services on the humane treatment of migrant children in HHS custody. My question for you is, when unaccompanied migrant children are encountered by CBP before transfer to HHS custody, how is the department ensuring that the facilities where they stay and the treatment that they receive is safe, humane, and takes into account the unique needs of unaccompanied minors?
Allow me to share with you, Senator, that our Border Patrol agents do nothing short of heroic work in fulfilling their responsibilities along the border under tremendous challenge, a challenge that has been the subject of much of the questioning of me today. It is a challenge that we are working tirelessly to meet successfully. We are very focused on the safety and well-being of the individuals who come into our custody, and that, of course, includes unaccompanied children. I have said before that a Border Patrol station is no place for a child to remain for any length of time. We are very focused on abiding by our legal obligation to transfer an unaccompanied child from our custody into the care of Health and Human Services within 72 hours. Our personnel do extraordinary work in addressing the needs of those children while they are in our custody and moving them safely to HHS for ultimate disposition.
What challenges are you trying to address that concern you about this process and the safe, responsible stewardship of unaccompanied minors who are in CBP custody or control during that period?
Senator, actually, what we need to do and what we are doing is building lawful, safe, and orderly pathways so that individuals do not need to place their lives, their well-being, in the hands of unscrupulous, ruthless smuggling organizations, so that parents who are desperate for relief do not place their children in the hands of those smugglers in an effort to achieve safety. We need to build lawful pathways, which is what we are doing.
Forgive me, Mr. Secretary, I agree with you, but I'm running out of time here. So my question is, what are the specific concerns or challenges that you worry about operationally when you think about the care and safety of these children when they're in DHS custody?
Senator, the vulnerability of the children themselves, the conditions within the Border Patrol stations. The Border Patrol stations were not designed for the care of unaccompanied children. The requisite level of staffing, which is why we sought and thankfully received more staffing resources in fiscal year 2023, and why we are seeking more resources in fiscal year 2024. We need to modernize our Border Patrol facilities, and thanks to infrastructure funding, we have it for the first time in any meaningful way. These are some of the things that concern us. We need more transportation resources, more personnel, better facilities. These are some of the challenges that we face, and yet amidst those challenges, our personnel do extraordinary work.
Thank you for the specifics. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Padilla, recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying I couldn't agree more. CBP custody is not a place for children. And speaking of children, I want to address, Mr. Chair, something that several of our colleagues have brought up throughout the course of this hearing, and that's the labor exploitation of migrant children. I know it's a legitimate place to raise questions about what else the Department of Homeland Security, the agencies within it, and the federal government writ large can do to better support migrant children. But let's be clear about something. It is the employers who are breaking child labor laws by placing children in hazardous conditions, as we've read multiple reports about. That's what prompted myself, together with our colleague, Senator Hickenlooper, to directly write to the CEOs of the companies named in the reports to hold them accountable for their actions. So I mention that only because we should not misplace the blame here. We need to hold unscrupulous employers accountable. Now, Mr. Secretary, I come with what I think are going to be unique questions that have not been raised in the committee yet, but equally important. You know, communities across the country are seeing ever more destructive and frequent extreme weather events. In fact, a new study led by scientists at Princeton University and my alma mater, MIT, examined flood risk for 171 counties along the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. Now, historically, 100-year floods have been just that, an intense flooding event that happens about once every 100 years. It's important when we're looking at where we build, where we plan, where we develop, and how we do so. A storm once every 100 years means that every year there's a 1% chance of a significant storm of that scale happening. But this study found that 100-year floods could actually become annual events in areas around New England and the Gulf Coast because of our changing climate. So this new reality is something that every community in California is already grappling with. And it's critical that the federal government take steps to mitigate this threat, not exacerbate it. And so I was disappointed to learn, Mr. Secretary, that CBP is currently building a barrier along the Tijuana River that, according to flood risk experts at the University of California, Irvine, poses a serious flooding risk to communities on both sides of the border. So I'd like to ask, what steps are you taking as Secretary to ensure that FEMA's processes, regulations, and of course, response once a disaster is declared is more fair and more equitable for survivors, regardless of what state or community they live in?
Senator, you correctly describe the challenge of climate change and the fact that the frequency and severity of extreme weather events is only increasing. I am not familiar with the particular situation that you described with respect to Tijuana. That is something that I will look into, and I look forward to circling back with you on that and working with you to address your concerns. It's not something with which I am
happy to share the reports with you and your staff, and look forward to working with you on that. Another item I want to raise, I saw you just a few weeks ago in Judiciary Committee, and I mentioned at the time, I raised some issues of FEMA and disaster response. And I just want to acknowledge some of the work and progress that's been made in these last few weeks. Thank you, Administrator Criswell and President Biden, for the grantee of the most recent major disaster declaration to aid in the recovery of parts of California that were most severely impacted by these last winter storms. Now, while California is enjoying a much-needed respite from the atmospheric rivers that devastated so many communities and agricultural fields, as you know, post a disaster, there's a long-term recovery and rebuilding that takes place. So since that Judiciary Committee hearing that I'm referencing, I was able to once again visit the community of Pájaro in Watsonville, meet with local officials and the families that were impacted, hundreds that are still displaced. So I can assure you, Mr. Secretary, the devastation is real. But I'm glad to see the federal government stepping up to respond to this particular incident. And as well as I think we're responding to this incident, it doesn't erase the fact that communities like Pájaro, which is low income and predominantly immigrant community, has been repeatedly overlooked for decades at all levels of government. So I raised the issue in judiciary, and unless you tell me the answer has changed, I'll assume you're still committed to working with me to revisit some of FEMA's processes, regulations, to make sure that both preparation before a disaster and certainly the response after a disaster, we work to make it more fair and more equitable for all victims and survivors. I do want to raise one specific item, though, in my time remaining. While I was there, listening to the families, and as you can imagine, hearing questions, concerns, complaints about the delays in their getting assistance or some of the obstacles, I'm told that several of the families there applied once to be denied, a second time only to be denied, a third, fourth time, at least 4 times, sometimes more, before getting an approval from FEMA for assistance that they deserve. It's not just a matter of time delays, but in that time, it's undue harm, financial and emotional pain that individuals and families bear. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Secretary, would you commit to working with FEMA, with Administrator Criswell and my office to assess how we can improve the application for assistance process to make it simpler, to make it more clear, to improve outreach, not just in English, but in other languages and through multiple platforms, so that individuals, families, and communities that are deserving of our support and assistance in recovery can do so more effectively and more efficiently.
I most certainly am, Senator, and I can assure you that FEMA is dedicated to achieving equity, speed, simplicity, accessibility in the care it provides to individuals who've suffered an extreme weather event.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you. Thank you for appearing before the committee to share the department's priorities for the upcoming fiscal year, as well as the resources that the department needs to combat all of the challenges that you highlighted here during the hearing. I look forward to working with my congressional colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the months ahead to ensure that the department gets the support that it needs to protect and secure the homeland. And on behalf of this committee, I also just want to take an opportunity to just thank the dedicated men and women at the Department of Homeland Security for their tireless work that they perform each and every day to keep our nation safe from serious and ever-evolving threats. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until May 3rd at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.